In this video, we're going to explore how Canada became the first Western country to adopt multiculturalism not as a temporary response to immigration, but as a permanent and central component of its national identity. We'll look at why this model spread across the West, and why it might now be reaching a point of crisis. What if, rather than being a model for the future, Canada is actually a warning? What if multiculturalism, once hailed as a utopian solution, has opened a Pandora's box the West can no longer close? To understand how Canada arrived at this point, we need to go back, not just a few years, but decades. Prior to the 1960s, Canada wasn't multicultural. It was bicultural. It was a country founded, at least officially, by two distinct peoples, the English and the French. These two cultural blocs had their tensions and rivalries, but the terms of Canada's national identity were relatively clear. Immigrants were expected to assimilate into one of the two cultural traditions. But this fragile balance began to break down in the 1960s, when Quebec nationalism surged in power and confidence. French-speaking Quebecers began to demand not just equal status, but cultural and political autonomy. In response, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau made a fateful decision. Rather than allow Canada to become a bilingual and binational state that might eventually fracture, he sought to redefine the nation itself. In 1971, Trudeau introduced official multiculturalism as state policy, the first of its kind in the Western world. Eric Kaufmann, in his landmark book Whiteshift, argues that this wasn't simply a response to rising immigration. It was a deliberate political strategy. By diluting the narrative of two founding cultures, Trudeau effectively weakened Quebec's claim to national distinction. If Canada was no longer defined by English and French heritage, but by a multiplicity of cultures from all over the world, then Quebec nationalism would become just one voice among many. It was an elegant political maneuver and a revolutionary one. Multiculturalism was enshrined in law in 1988, and over the years, it evolved from a policy into a national religion. Canada wasn't just a country that welcomed immigrants, it was now a post-national society, a global project in which all cultures were to be equally celebrated, preserved, and institutionalized. What made this so radical was that the host society was expected not only to accommodate newcomers, but to fundamentally redefine itself in the process. This cultural shift was accompanied by a new ideological framework. National identity, once thought to be essential to social cohesion, was increasingly portrayed as dangerous, exclusionary, even racist. In its place, a new ideal emerged: global citizenship. The cosmopolitan elite that took shape in Canadian universities, media, and government believed that the future belonged not to nations, but to networks. The citizen of tomorrow wouldn't identify with a flag or a history, but with universal human rights, diversity, and open borders. Justin Trudeau, the son of the multicultural revolution's founding father, made this ideology explicit when he declared in 2015 that Canada has no core identity. For many Canadians, this sounded noble. For others, it sounded like erasure. If a nation has no core identity, then who belongs to it? What connects its people? What does it mean to be Canadian? While the political class embraced post-nationalism, many ordinary citizens began to feel a growing sense of alienation. Kaufmann describes this as the rise of ethno-traditional nationalism, not a return to racism or xenophobia, but a desire for cultural continuity. People want to recognize their country when they walk through their neighborhoods. They want their children to speak the national language. They want a shared sense of history, values, and purpose. The multicultural model, in its radical Canadian form, denies that impulse. It replaces integration with coexistence. It privileges group identity over shared identity. And over time, this has produced unintended consequences: ethnic enclaves that resist assimilation, parallel societies with divergent norms, a decline in trust between communities, and an increase in ethnic voting blocs, where political loyalty is often shaped more by heritage than by ideology. One of the most fascinating case studies is Quebec itself. While the rest of Canada embraced multiculturalism, Quebec took a different path. Its leaders resisted federal multicultural policy, insisting instead on interculturalism, a model in which immigrants are welcome, but are expected to integrate into the majority French-speaking culture. Quebec enforces strict language laws, limits religious symbols in public institutions, and prioritizes the preservation of its cultural heritage. The result? Immigrants in Quebec often assimilate more quickly than those in Toronto or Vancouver. They speak the local language, understand the local customs, and identify more strongly with the host society. Quebec, ironically, has maintained a form of civic nationalism that is now rare in the West. It hasn't fully rejected diversity, but it has refused to sacrifice cultural coherence in its name. The rest of Canada, however, has gone much further. It has adopted a model in which culture is no longer a collective achievement, but a private right. The state funds thousands of cultural associations based on ethnicity, supports minority languages and media, and celebrates diversity as an end in itself. But what happens when this ideology runs up against economic hardship, social tension, or political instability? Multiculturalism, Kaufmann warns, can only survive in times of abundance. When resources are scarce, identity becomes a battleground. When people feel their culture is under threat, they retreat into tribalism. When institutions prioritize representation over competence or merit, public trust declines. And when political elites deny the legitimacy of majority identity, they create the very populist backlash they claim to fear. Indeed, Canada has not been immune to these trends. Though often ignored by international media, Canada has seen its share of protests, hate crimes, and political polarization. The rise of identity-based movements on both the left and right is a sign that multicultural harmony is far from guaranteed. In many urban centers, ethnic and religious tensions are quietly growing. And while critics are often silenced with accusations of racism or bigotry, the questions they raise remain unanswered. What does it mean to belong to a nation that has no core identity? How can democracy function when cultural reference points are no longer shared? Can a society that privileges fragmentation over unity survive long-term? Canada's model inspired imitators across the Anglosphere and beyond. Australia and New Zealand adopted similar policies. The United Kingdom flirted with multiculturalism in the 1990s, only to later retract it. Germany tried a hybrid model and then pulled back. France rejected it entirely and emphasized assimilation, but with little success. Of all these countries, only Canada stuck to its course, even doubling down in the face of rising global skepticism. The Canadian elite now finds itself in a paradox. On one hand, it wants to maintain its global image as the multicultural utopia. On the other, it must govern a society that is increasingly anxious, divided, and uncertain of its future. Rather than reassessing the model, leaders continue to insist that the only problem is racism, that is, the people, not the policy. But perhaps the real problem is that Canada, in opening this Pandora's box, never asked how it would close it. What started as a strategy to resolve internal divisions became a full-blown ideology. And like all ideologies, it resists revision, even in the face of evidence. This is why Canada matters. It is not just a North American nation with a unique history. It is the petri dish of the Western world's post-national experiment. If it succeeds, then perhaps the future really is one of peaceful diversity. But if it fails, then it offers a warning that without cultural cohesion, even the most prosperous societies can unravel. If you found this video insightful, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. And if you'd like to support this work, you can donate through our Buy Me a Coffee link below. Every contribution helps us keep going, and keep asking the hard questions others are afraid to touch.